All right, we're rolling now. We had a little temporary difficulty.
See if you can get it to level.
Oh, there we go. There you are.
Bob. Everybody called him Bob.
We always called him Bob.
Robert S. Neuman, Mr. Neuman.
Over the course of his 7-decade career, Robert Neuman addressed the same complex artistic issues over and over again because he felt with passion and determination that these issues symbolize the paradoxes that lie at the heart of the human condition. Robert Neuman was born in Kellogg, Idaho in 1926 and grew up the only child of the owners of a hardware store in this small mining town. His parents were very strict with their son, but also, sensing his talent, saw to it that he took every art class he could, in some cases more than once, while insisting that he focus on illustration and design as opposed to fine art, so that he could have a proper career. Shortly after he graduated from high school, Neuman was drafted into the Army and posted to a series of different bases across the United States. The many illustrated letters he sent back to his high school girlfriend, Patty Fedderson, show his skill as a draftsman and his budding sense of humor. Upon his discharge from the Army in 1945, Neuman returned to Kellogg, where he and Fedderson married. After a year studying at the University of Idaho in Moscow, they moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, a world apart from Kellogg. Neuman, with his parents' advice in mind, began studies in design at the California College of the Arts, but quickly sensing an affinity to American artists from the Bay Area school, he switched to fine art as soon as he could.
I was quite naive coming from the Rocky Mountains. What would I know about art collectors? When I began, I was in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco there, and I saw a lot of Clifford Still's paintings because he was living there then, and Diebenkorn and a number of other people, and some well-known artists who were classmates of mine, like Nathan Oliveira and Peter Volkas and so forth.
Working in this highly creative atmosphere and exploring painting primarily, but also printmaking and drawing, Neuman earned undergraduate and graduate fine art degrees from the California College of the Arts and took additional courses at Mills College. Neuman went on to receive grants to study in Europe and taught at Rhode Island School of Design, Brown University, SUNY New Paltz, Massachusetts College of Art, Harvard, and Keene State College. He had one-man shows at prominent galleries in Boston and New York, along with exhibitions and acquisitions at major public and academic museums across the country and in Venice, Barcelona, Stuttgart, and in Japan. Neuman and Fedderson had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Ingrid, before they divorced in the late 1960s. In the late 1970s, Neuman met and married art dealer Sonny Savage, and the two had 1 child, Christina. All the while, Robert Neuman was making art, exhibiting that work, and teaching. And wherever he was teaching, making art, and living, he spent summers in Maine from the late 1950s until his death in 2015. A complicated, crucial, and consistent element in Neuman's work is the way he made use of the many places he lived and worked. The way he drew inspiration from these places varied widely, but one can always find evidence of them, these pieces of the world, to use the term of one of his major series. The black paintings, Neuman's earliest sustained body of work came about through his sensitivity to the calamities of the Second World War and his year in post-war Germany as a Fulbright Fellow in 1953. Patty Feddersen describes their impressions of a heavily damaged Stuttgart, a post-war world bombed into pieces.
Stuttgart was a city of facades, and behind which was the rubble. And they didn't have room for their population to live, let alone Fulbright students, so they were not happy to see us.
Neuman's artwork from this period was influenced by these scenarios and by his interest in and interactions with German artists such as Willy Baumeister and Fritz Winter.
And I found these paintings by a man named Fritz Winter, and I liked them a lot. I subsequently found out he had been a student at the Bauhaus. And in 1953, when I received my Fulbright grant to Germany, he had returned to Germany. He had been a prisoner of war in a Russian prison camp for many years, I think 4 years, something like that, and he had painted in prison with a stick in the dirt of the prison yard, and then he'd wipe it out and make another painting like that till he finally got back to Germany. But his work is very abstract, but in a design way it relates to elements of the world. It's not just abstract theory. It is such that you feel that some things are either earth or rock or tree or something. You sense that there's nature in the paintings when you see them, and yet there are no recognizable images there.
Neuman returned to Europe in 1956 on another travel grant, awarded this time by the Guggenheim Foundation. He chose Barcelona because of other artists who had worked or who were working there. As in Germany, his approach to painting was deeply impacted by his acute observations of the visual subtleties of this part of the world.
I was sitting in a cafe in Barrio Gótico, and I looked up a certain calle there, and it was so narrow, and the sun was on the other side of the buildings from where I was, and this street was so narrow that the sunlight came through. It was like a needle. It looked like a needle optically, and it struck me as a very interesting having interesting compositional potential. So I made a whole series of paintings called Barcelona paintings.
The early to mid-1960s Pedazos del Mundo, Pieces of the World series struck a new and dynamic approach to place. This body of work's expressive representation and controlled abstraction was acclaimed by critics, dealers, collectors, and other artists. Subsequent series expanded on this combination of indirect and unmistakable references to places general and specific. The Space Signs series, for example, makes use of carefully simplified and quietly painterly marks to invoke celestial objects and the universal themes inevitably associated with them. In a parallel vein, works in the Monuments series refer unmistakably to cairns, mounds, and other structures, while remaining first and foremost explorations of form, color, and expression. While exploring these imaginary but rooted visual spaces, Neuman also remained fascinated by the complicated specifics of his own Western birthplace. He traveled there on numerous occasions and eventually melded his visual observations, his emotional reactions, and his compositional approaches into the Lame Deer series. One such trip was made by car in the mid-1970s, non-stop from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Kellogg, Idaho, with his then new brother-in-law, Rob Savage. Savage's account of a crucial nighttime encounter illustrates the kind of quietly intense attention Neuman paid to both a visual and a spiritual delving into landscape and memory.
We could see probably 40 or 50 miles away this light white, bright light. And what the hell is that? And so we're heading, it's on our way, we're heading right forward on our way to Lame Deer. And it turns out that it's an open pit mining operation that's in full bore, the middle of the night. So we sat there and watched this operation for about an hour because we were tired from driving. Bob never really talked about Lame Deer in terms of a potential series or art, something that was representational to him until we left the area. And I think it was the first time he had a real intrigue about going there, that he was really excited about getting to see what was going on in the landscape.
The Ship to Paradise series is another instance of a body of work both specific to a resonant place and wide-ranging in symbolic meaning. Neuman was living seasonally on Maine's Mount Desert Island by 1966. He was a keen, humorously lugubrious observer of the dynamics and the minutiae of harbor life and the ocean, evidence of which is clear in the narrative and the geometric elements of the Ship to Paradise works.
I went to Bob's house one day. Why? And he said, "Come with me, I want to give you something." And we went upstairs and he pulled a big flat file box, out from under the bed. And he said, "Pick one of these." So I picked this. It's curious to look at. It's very animated. There are coils and circles and disparate things that you can't quite fit together, but plainly the ship. And it's the Ship to Paradise. And what I see in it is a very ramshackle ship, that word ship shape just doesn't apply. It's
right.
Falling apart. I mean, it has paddles, it has this big bell off the front. Nobody seems to be on the ship. There's nobody steering it. Here's what should be the rudder handle, right? Nobody's there. I don't see anybody. Do you see any human person in this thing?
Neuman worked in these series often for years or even decades, but as he responded in diverse ways to the various places he found himself, his works ranged widely in terms of styles, materials, and concerns.
He was really a serial painter. He'd attach himself to a theme, and then he'd do that theme over and over again, just like Monet with his haystacks, only a very abstract sequence. And Bob loved that, and that clearly influenced him. So when he got to the point where he was doing the Pedazo del Mundo or the Space Signs or those series, or even the Lame Deer, he would grab onto something and then take it as far as he could take it.
The series that was most prolific during our time together, which was actually 37 years, was the Lame Deer paintings. And we'd talk about the symbols that he would use in the paintings, the teepees.
Bob, as an artist, was poetic. I think that he was not super concerned with being hardcore consistent. He was willing to wander. He was willing to make kind of sideways connections, which is one of the things I admire about him, because at that time in particular, in the 60s and 70s, that was one of the things that sort of indicated a really accomplished, serious artist, was to be totally obsessed with one thing and to go deeper and deeper with one thing. Bob moved around a lot. His work changed. He moved from things to things, and that's more a contemporary way of working. It's more a comfortable place for artists to work from now, but at that time, I'm sure it probably created some discomfort for him.
Neuman was clear that he believed that different forms of art should stay in their lanes, as it were. Here he is in a rare interview describing emphatically what he saw as the separate realms of painting and sculpture.
It's surprising how many people don't realize painting is a visual business, and they think of it as a physical business somehow, but that's sculpture, that's not painting. Is physical, the physicality is important in sculpture. Painting is a visual experience, and that's something I find unusual, that people have that old saw, what is it? They think the painting should be a duck or a lobster or a sailboat or something, and no matter what you do, they still have that idea.
That said, there is plenty of evidence in his works and in statements by artists, former students, and collectors of Neuman's interest in and use of dimensional materials, pieces of the world, in his paintings.
And I remember walking with Bob somewhere at some point on the street, and he noticed a yellow circle on the street, or yeah, must have been in the street. And it was that paint that they use to paint yellow lines that's thick. It has a dimension, and he kind of picked at it, like he wanted to borrow it for a painting. So Albert Alcalay was sharing the studio with Bob, and Bob was painting, and the two were together there, and it was right across the street from a craft store. And Bob started using tape in his paintings. He would glue the tape to the surface. And he was also using it to, make shapes or whatever, but there's one painting in the Keene show. It's a palazzo with 4 circles. And up in the right-hand corner, there's a square, and it looks like there's some tape glued right in there. But for a while, he was doing a lot of that with just gluing colored tape to the surface. And I thought, oh my God, that's going to fall off someday. I don't think it ever did. But that was quite different from, nobody was doing that. Not even top guys.
He was always working with, masking tape and different kinds of packing tape, that brown packing tape, putting it down on his paintings. And inevitably, because he would be working on so many paintings at one time, he would forget to take the paint off, and it would become really embedded in the linseed oil because he used so much linseed oil. And I remember when I was a grad student, he would say things like, Ingrid, you've got to come to the studio and help me get this tape off these paints. How do I get the tape off? And I had learned at that point about a lot of solvents, about using scalpels and different mechanical methods. So I set him up with some, ideas.
Something he did a lot was he used things around the studio as mark makers. And one of the most prevalent was that he would take cans of paint and dip them in paint and really print with them, print on the paintings to get circles. And he would also take like yardsticks and paint the edge of the yardstick and use that as a way to make lines, just as a printer.
This strong attention to places in and pieces of the world didn't mean Neuman somehow ignored or downplayed the physicality and focus central to painting itself. He was a modernist painter. Neuman had a strong sense of the canvas as a site for exploration, discovery, and even struggle. This surface was a key piece of Neuman's world. Throughout his career, Neuman used his hard-won knowledge of the ways oil paint needed to be prepared and applied to create paintings that, whatever else he or others might see them containing, were made up in a phenomenological sense of layer upon layer of applied color.
I haven't used a palette in years. I spend a good deal of time up in Mount Desert Island in Maine, and I work on watercolors and so forth there. But in the winter time, it's impossible to go to a certain place. It's called Scudic Point, and it's a peninsula sticks out in the raw ocean, and they close the roads because it's so bad. The storms and ice and piling up of snow and everything else, falling down trees, and so I often wondered how it was in the winter because you can't go out there to see, and so I walked out there a few times and got an idea. And plus, winter is winter in Maine, no matter where you are, I guess. And so therefore, I worked for several years on this painting, Winter Storm Scudic, trying to think of what it was like out there. So it's such a beautiful place.
Well, you got the coolness and the colors, the white and the blue, but you can't restrain yourself from putting in a dash of red. I mean, there is that Neuman touch.
Neuman, primarily identified as a painter, was always fascinated with new materials and techniques, both within and beyond that medium. For example, for the first 2 decades of his career, he confined his printmaking activities, with a few exceptions, to works developed in close stylistic parallel with the Pedazos del Mundo paintings. Then, in the mid-1970s, he embarked upon 2 different directions in printmaking. He started to produce etchings that were created in part by collaging numerous actual items, literally pieces of the world, onto the etching plate. Eyeglasses, a ring, a paper clip, a tin can lid, a bobby pin. Here, evidence of the day-to-day reality of Neuman's own world is physically, albeit indirectly, incorporated into his work. Nearly simultaneously, Neuman began the Ship to Paradise series, making greater use of acute real-world observations than any other body of work. This works on paper project balanced these elements with an explicit literary allegory. Neuman said that these works were a graphic offshoot of his paintings, and early prints in the vein of Philip Heckscher's do occasionally contain visually independent geometric elements that recall paintings. Over time, though, the formal elements appearing in a Ship to Paradise work seem increasingly designed to more directly propel the narrative of a ship at sea and more richly support the allegory of humankind's universal struggle. The Lame Deer series, like Ship to Paradise, is rooted in the artist's intense focus on a specific location, in this case, the extraordinary landscapes of his western birthplace. Neuman grew up exploring these lands and returned often to see family and visit familiar places. He also grew up seeing and later expressed interest in preserving threatened instances of native art. In the same American Archives of American Art interview where he talks about these issues, he also touches on his interest in using abstraction to make a statement, in this case, a statement about what he termed sociological concerns relating to Native Americans. In the interview, Neuman carefully spells out the role that teepee poles, the sole overt Native imagery in the series, played in his practice. They helped him identify, probe, and resolve aesthetic and material connections and distinctions across paintings and works on paper, pouring, brushing, dripping, drawing, inscribing, and stamping. The implied pyramid of the teepee provided Neuman with a structure both rugged and delicate that he used for nearly 40 years to explore the complexities of how color and line operate in painting and drawing. So apart from the value of all of these inherent qualities to the viewer, what is the art historical significance of Robert Neuman's work? This isn't a simple question. Neuman's work exemplifies the problem with a model of progress that consists of a series of rare breakthroughs by a very few individuals, a model that leaves out the diversity and the subtle richnesses of the human enterprise in art as in so much else.
I think the whole concept of sort of a second generation abstract expressionist is almost a little kind of belittling to me. You know, it's sort of like, oh, that was the first generation and they did all the foundation work, and then this group came along and you know, picked up on what they were doing. Yes, that's true to a certain extent. I mean, Bob wouldn't have been able to go as far as he did without some of that already happening before him. We always stand on the shoulders of the ones before us. But I also feel like he created something entirely new with his work.
I liked Max Beckmann's paintings very much, and so I was very pleased to be allowed in his class. We had a very small class, and he couldn't speak much English, and his wife, Peppy, was there, the one he painted so many times with the little dog over her arm, and
well,
she
in
could
your
speak
paintings, how did Beckmann influence you? In color, in tone, substance, style, tone?
I think a great deal of the influence comes from my part of admiration for him, that he could make paintings like he did. And I never considered myself expert, but I did study him quite a bit, and he looked at my paintings very much, but he comes from a different background than I did, and I didn't have to flee the Nazis for years like he did, and lose paintings and everything else.
Those familiar with Beckmann's essentially figurative work might be surprised at Neuman's great interest in the émigré Beckmann. Perhaps instead of learning a style from Beckmann, Neuman was learning how to filter other influences, just as Beckmann had done, and maybe he was drawn to the deliberate matter-of-factness espoused by the Neue Sachlichkeit movement Beckmann had been a part of. The other European artist frequently mentioned in connection with Neumann's work is Wassily Kandinsky. Indeed, Neuman himself wrote about and mentioned the Russian artist and theorist on numerous occasions, but he sometimes used humor to avoid admitting his interest.
I'm influenced by the artists that I believe in, and it's a visual trip. You can't have a recording, you get down the corner and put it on and tell who's the most best artist. You have to know yourself by seeing it, or touching it, or whatever. So that's the way it is.
Kandinsky.
Well, there's a lot of, I thought Rembrandt was pretty good too. He started out a little earlier, but Kandinsky, sure.
I think Kandinsky represented to Bob, you know, he was really one of the first and one of the greatest abstract painters of the 20th century. And he broke all kinds of rules. He also, I think, importantly tied his work to the spiritual in art. And I think that's something that also Bob was drawn to, the spirituality of abstraction.
Neuman did not chase significance for its own sake. Although he had a great deal of confidence in his own work, his series-based manner of working and the major changes in approach he undertook over his career did not make critical categorization or market labeling easy. That said, his works received, and he in his own way enjoyed, acclaim in certain parts of the art world.
Well, of course, when he had his sellout show at the Pace Gallery in Newbury Street, and I knew that he was going someplace because everybody wanted a Neuman.
His 1960 solo show at Pace in Boston sold out, and Arnie invited Louise Nevelson to be in the gallery, and so during the time Bob was represented by Pace in Boston in 1960 to 1962, he really did well for them. He helped them and helped the launch, but he liked the company he was in the gallery. He liked the other artists that Arnie was showing and picking, and he felt like he had choice. He could do really whatever he wanted. So when he was asked to go to New York and be with Pace Gallery in New York, he was very circumspect, because I think for him, who else was in the gallery? What other artists were in the gallery who was going to be seen with his work was of critical importance to him. He really wanted the caliber of the work to be serious.
I think he was quite ambitious as an artist. But his ambitions were all about art too, that's what and he wasn't ambitious about money, I don't think. I'm sure not. Everything was art.
I think that my dad considered his work masterpieces. From being the person who was handling these paintings with him, oh my goodness, like I couldn't be more careful. It's funny because he didn't wrap everything in bubble and glassine or whatever you call it, but like, you know, you had to be so careful moving these things, and he wanted them lit just so. And I mean, I remember when we had this show at the Heckscher Museum of Art, and he was all upset because they had the lights down really low, but they technically had the lights down really low because it's a watercolor show, so they didn't want to damage the watercolors. But he wanted everybody to kind of be able to see his work. And I mean, he thought his work was it, which is great. I mean, he should think his work is it. He's creating them. He should be very proud of them.
Neuman himself saw more connections than differences between post-war styles or schools, placing them and his own work in a continuum that included a wide range of approaches.
His color is incredibly bold and just lends this side, sort of like Hans Hofmann too, just lends this side of almost being shrill and unbearable, but in fact it's very satisfying. You know, I don't think Bob was an expressionist in terms of, you know, the stories he was telling. I think his expression was in color and in shape and the sort of presence. These were big paintings, a lot of his paintings, so they had a very physical presence in a room, in a gallery.
An artist like Neuman, working at a time of great historical change and in an art environment that was literally invested in novelty, was always going to have a complicated relationship with artists from the recent and the more distant past. He saw, even in the dynamics of the commercial side of art practice, the crucial importance of place.
I love to think of Bob as a young man, you know, brought up in rural Idaho, going on his first trip to California and suddenly encountering a whole alien world of art, and not turning away from it, just looking at it and going, oh my God, look what's happening, and just being so open to what he was seeing and excited. And, you know, he made that comment about, here I was just, you know, doing landscapes of Coeur d'Alene and, you know, and almost like, you know, painting himself as sort of a provincial. And then suddenly, you know, a couple weeks later, he's in a space with Clifford Still and Richard Diebenkorn and other of the great Pacific School, the California abstract painters, and it's just his sense of wonder, and then his embrace of that being open to new ways of expressing himself is just it's a wonderful turning point in his life.
San Francisco, the École de Pacifique, or the San Francisco School, California School, we call it. Had an influence from the East, very much from the Far East, because it was the closest part of the United States to that area, and I got that too. But the thing when I was quite young was that the American school was slowly stealing the picnic from the European artists.
What was this picnic, this mix of sophisticated influences Neuman alludes to in his usual deadpan manner? When pressed about intellectual influences on his work, especially later in life, Neuman usually demurred, However, against this seeming denial of conscious interest in selected predecessors, we've only to note Neuman's drive to study with advanced European artists early in his career, the connections between his work and theirs, his respect for their worldly experiences, and his determination to travel to their piece of the world, Europe, to realize that this was not quite the whole truth.
I like the paraphrase of the Gilbert and Sullivan. He is the very model of the independent artist. I mean, of the artists that I've known, he had almost the most singular way of looking at the world of art and his place in it. I think he felt that he knew what he was doing and didn't really need the rest of the world really to tell him what to do, essentially.
This model of the individual artist lyric that Carl Little refers to recalls James McNeill Whistler, the model for aesthetics-driven artist figures in several Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, and another American artist who, like Neuman, explored unusual directions in both painting and printmaking while holding himself apart from the dominant art practices of the time. The two artists' works have little in common visually, but Whistler may be a useful historical model. Like Neuman, Whistler had no school of artist followers, but nonetheless powerfully affected subsequent art history through the impact his work had on a very few key critics, collectors, and dealers. Two examples. Arnie Glimcher, a former student of Neuman's, founded Pace Gallery in Boston in 1960 before eventually moving the business to New York and expanding it into today's influential global enterprise. Glimcher showed Neuman's work 4 times in the first 2 years that Pace was open, including the inaugural group show and 3 subsequent solo shows. And Allan Stone, founder of the influential Allan Stone Gallery, first encountered Neuman's work in Boston exhibitions in the late 1950s while Stone was a student there. Stone and Neuman formed a personal and professional bond that prompted Stone to abandon a career as a lawyer in order to open a gallery and collect numerous Neuman works.
And so Allan just decided in 1961, in December of 1961, to open a gallery. And one of the reasons he opened that gallery, or wanted to open that gallery, was to give Bob Neuman a show. And he wasn't the first artist Allan showed, but over time, you know, as Allan got more established, Bob was one of the early, certainly early people that he showed.
Stone went on to represent artists as diverse and successful as Robert Arneson, John Chamberlain, Joseph Cornell, Richard Estes, Willem de Kooning, Arshel Gorky, Franz Klein, Sue Miller, and Wayne Thiebaud. While building his gallery enterprise, Stone invited Neuman, who had already spent several summers in Ogunquit, Maine, to join the lively and influential summer cultural community on Mount Desert Island. Stone traded a house he owned there that backed right up to Acadia National Park for several of Neuman's paintings. The two men introduced their families and remained friends for their entire lives. And through exhibitions, sales, and advocacy, Stone actively supported Neuman's career until Stone's death in 2006, the year his gallery presented the celebratory 50 years Robert S. Neuman.
One thing about Robert Neuman was that he was diligent. His occupation was an artist.
You know, he wasn't somebody who really showed emotion visually on his face, and that's why, and this is what's interesting, that's why his work was so astonishing, because these paintings were like so powerful and so emotional and so explosive, and he was this really calm, incredibly straight-faced, poker-faced person, and yet he produced this incredibly powerful emotional work that you wouldn't have, if you had said, okay, match the artist with the work, right? But then you would say that maybe about a lot of other you know, artists. You can't really, you don't know what's inside someone, you know, and art is the process that really brings out not only what's in their head, what they're thinking about, but what's inside of them. And I think that he really, you know, painted from his heart.
Bob absolutely loved Northeast Harbor. He loved our house. It was like a boat, something to pour money into. And every time he sold a major painting and had a bit of cash, it would go into the house. He would find something else to do to the house. Well, the first major funds that he had was from the sale of the Lame Deer triptych that was donated to the Hood Museum by Herbert Plimpton. He used that money to take a garage that was unattached to the house and attach it to the house and make it into a dining room. He really enjoyed, you know, putting things together for the house. And the house is a very special place. It is all Bob Neuman. The floor, you walk in, living room, the floor is yellow, the ceiling is blue. The walls have his abstract paintings on them. You walk into the hallway, and the hallway is red. The steps going up to the second floor are blue. You walk into the dining room, the floor is orange. It's just very, very colorful. It can be cold, it can be rainy, it can be snowy, it can be foggy, and when you're in that house, it's all sunshine.
Bob did have a wonderful sense of humor, and the stories he would tell about himself. He loved to tell stories, you know, the things that we do that are funny or stupid and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if anybody's mentioned this, but when he was teaching up at Keene, I guess he had a station wagon at one time that he had traded, maybe he traded a painting for the station wagon. And back in those days, I smoked, Bob smoked, and that's probably how we got to know each other, because we did smoke together. And it was when everything was, you know, it was kind of like you shouldn't be smoking, so we'd wind up outside underneath a tree smoking. And he said one time, you know, I was coming back from Keene College, go down to Boston, and I had some paintings in the back, and they were all kind of wrapped up in moving blankets, and I'm driving down the road. It was a beautiful summer day or what have you, and I had the window down, and I started smelling smoke. And he's like, you know, how could that be? It must be a fire somewhere. And he looked around, didn't see any smoke or anything, and then eventually he started seeing smoke in the back of his station wagon. And he realized that evidently he had flicked an ash out of the window that may have like blown in the back of the station wagon. And so he pulls off the side of the road, and goes around the back of the station wagon, opens the door up and starts pulling out all the paintings, and the blanket's on fire, and he's trying to put it out. So, anyhow.
Neuman liked using the sophistication of the art world as a foil for his own plain-spoken manner, which, of course, was but a mask for his acute sensitivity.
You didn't know, with Robert, you didn't know if he was telling a joke or if he was serious. And I came to understand that, with Robert, he was serious about everything, but he had a wonderful sense of humor about it. I remember the last exhibition we had of his work, and we were in the process of renovating the outside of the gallery, and it had scaffolding on it, and I was sorry that we had scaffolding, but he was so happy to be there with all of his family, and he had these bright red striped socks on, and he was holding court in front of all of his work, and I think, you know, I'll take that memory with me, because it was clearly a good moment for him.
Almost invariably, when discussing his own work, Neuman would veer from self-deprecation to utter confidence.
I wanted to express an image without an outline to it. So often in the history of art, everything is drawn with outlines and colored on later. So I decided to make a blue rose, a flesh rose, a black rose, 2 or 3 gray roses, and each canvas is one color. This is 6 foot square and solid black, but you still can see the rose. The rose takes the space of the entire canvas. The rose.
Well, it's very organic, starting right
yeah,
from here
exactly.
and going up to the top.
Exactly, and I had to figure out a way where you could see the rose without changing the colors, because this one's going to be all black and another one's all blue. So I decided to do it in a tactile fashion. So I used black pigment, opaque black pigment, matte black, and restricted that pretty much to the rose itself. And then the other space is much flatter. So I used, instead of changing colors, I just changed the tactile surface of the painting. And it's amazing when there's a light in the room striking the painting, the impasto or the pigment catches the light and helps to portray the rose.
It's clear that Neuman loved the act of painting, just as he loved that parallel activity, teaching. He enjoyed both and worked hard at both, each in their own way.
We used to jokingly call him the Whistler because, or my class did, we started calling him the Whistler. And you used to hear him coming. He'd be coming down the hallway and he'd be whistling. I wonder if he whistled so we'd know he was coming. So we wouldn't be gossiping about our classes or whatever, or doing whatever bad thing we weren't supposed to be doing. But you have to put a lot of time in the studio, and you tend to overlap. And then there's class as well. So we were around him quite a bit in casual time like that, so to speak, casual time. But yeah, he was there at night. And so he had a very fatherly presence in that way, both. And he didn't hesitate to come up and give you some advice or a critique, or he didn't. But when I graduated, he backed off. I still worked up there. And after I'd graduated, there was a notable retreat from offering that. So he acknowledged that. And as I started to say at the beginning, there was an interesting dichotomy, or there was an interesting blend of that in him, of many things, of the formality with the joking, the helpfulness with the knowing when to retreat, etc. And he was very whole that way.
The Pritchard Art Gallery, close to Neuman's Kellogg, Idaho birthplace, hosted a major exhibition of the artist's work in 2013.
This was a major retrospective, so the installation was 2 stories, but it was kind of open. So so the second floor was more drawings, I think, and then the first floor with the big ceilings was all the big paintings. So my dad was mic'd up, and my mom was kind of cueing him, like if he was kind of going off, veering off topic a little bit. She would kind of, "Oh, Bob, let's talk about this painting now," And then he'd have some wisecrack about his wife bossing him around. But he got to this point where he was talking to the students about how being an artist, like, it isn't easy. It's hard. You have to have the drive to create the work continuously. You're going to be critiqued. It's a long road. I mean, I can't quote him verbatim, but he literally got teary-eyed. And I think he just wanted to tell them that it wasn't going to be an easy road, but it was worth it. And that if they wanted to be an artist and that they had a drive, that they should do it. And it was just a really amazing moment for me, because I never saw that sort of emotional side of things from my dad.
Robert Neuman was exploring new directions in materials, meaning, and intent up until the last years of his life, through paintings as diverse in color, texture, and composition as Lame Deer Big Eagle, Lame Deer Shoshone, Transition Painting, and The Message. As with Albert Bierstadt and Jackson Pollock, 2 other complicated American artists who he expressly respected, Neuman sought to visually thematize the specific and the general conditions of an ever-changing world. This lifelong drive to imaginatively meld the pieces and the world is analogous to the approaches of Philip Guston and Jules Olitsky, two artists Neuman named as contemporaries of great interest. That said, Neuman spoke in plain terms about his own work. He occasionally referred to the words of others to prompt further thoughts of his own. In 1987, for example, he approvingly quotes Boston Globe art critic Robert Taylor's analysis of a major painting entitled Spanish Landscape. He, Taylor, sometimes calls my work emblematic abstraction because there's this kind of emblem that keeps coming up. I enjoy that aspect of symbolizing in an emblematic way, so that a circle filled with certain partitions becomes like an emerald. Here is Neuman once again expressing straightforwardly an approach to painting in which abstraction and representation meet. There's something refreshingly direct and also deeply informed about Neuman's description to Carl Little of the thinking and the technique behind 1965's Beach Figure, a painting Neuman is clearly happy to see after a gap of many years. Let's leave him here in the gallery in front of this painting, talking about how he melded pieces of the world into the emblematic abstraction he saw as his uttermost goal.
What I did here was build a figure right in here, lying on the beach. This ivory color is the beach sand, and the hot orange is and reds is the figure, armature of the figure. But most of this painting, I used tape, masking tape, to draw with. Instead of drawing with a pencil and get a little tiny line, I put these broad pieces of tape to block out certain colors, and then I pull it off afterwards. And I thought it was give it a little different dimension because the line of the tape was quite pronounced, you see. And of course, this is the sky up here and the horizon